Morning. Y'all see Kentucky now?
Yes.
On air, or TV or TV broadcast? TV.
That'll give you.
Oh, cool, very cool. QR code.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Let me make sure my phone is on off, because this is about the time I get calls from friends.
I have
You put ketchup on your cheesesteak yet?
kept my
Not yet.
I keep my
do
phone
that
on.
yet.
I've kept my phone on silent for years, or not silent but vibrate. I think it's just from covering courts,
Yeah.
and you can get thrown out of a courtroom
That's what
for
I
having
heard,
your
yeah.
phone on. So I just, it's my lifestyle now. I'm not gonna have time to, like, the links to stories.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna have time to put them on this, because we're starting in 2 minutes, so I just have to wing it.
So they're not going to be able to see the stories?
They're gonna, I already uploaded all your handouts.
Yeah, okay.
And they're in sequence.
Okay.
So if you wanna refer to, like, if you remember what all the handouts are.
Yeah.
If you wanna tell them to look at a particular handout, they'll
Okay.
have access to it. Yeah.
Okay.
So. Okay, I think wait, just, I know we're supposed to start at 9.
Yeah.
Can you tell them that we're just gonna say that we're gonna give 2 or 3 more minutes for more people to come in, and then we'll start.
Good morning. We're gonna start in about 2 or 3 minutes, so, looking forward to talk about, one of our favorite subjects. 8:59, yes, so about 3 minutes. Good morning. Got a QR code in there.
Do you remember your points, or do you need to see them on the screen?
Yeah, I could see it. You're still number 2, right?
Yeah, okay, and then I would like to, at the top, just let people know the kinds of tips we'll be giving them. So do you mind introducing me last? And then we'll flow into that discussion. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. You look good too.
Don't pack everything you thought you packed. You just had to put something together.
No, it's cute.
Exactly.
No, it looks good. No, I don't mean whatever. Okay, but do you need this for anybody else
Yes.
coming in?
Yes. As people come in, I'm gonna.
No.
No, some of the things didn't, I don't know why, just your points, a couple of them didn't port over, so I'm adding them back over. I'm on the last one after this, so.
Oh, yeah.
Good morning. I'm Gary Eslick. I'm the breaking news editor and race and culture editor at the Tennessean. It's a Gannett newspaper in Nashville. Like I do in my office, I walk a lot. I don't like sitting at a desk. I think because I'm a former sports reporter, I also like counting my steps. So you can't, yeah. These people behind me are very important to me in my life, not just my career, but my life. I'm happy that we could do this session together. Unfortunately, we don't have a TV, but everyone has a QR code. If people come in, I will share it with them. We're here to talk about storytelling, which is super important in journalism today because it isn't as important as it used to be. We're all in different ways chasing page views, if we're being honest, to a certain extent. And we have to find better ways to balance good journalism with it, right? And I'm not talking about big J journalism or projects that you get to spend weeks and months on at those dream jobs. How you get to that space, you gotta perform in the job you have now. So we're gonna try to give you some tips that on a daily basis you can incorporate into your copy, into your packages. It doesn't have to be a project to do something special. Just small little techniques that we're gonna talk about. We're also gonna explain the difference between writing and storytelling. Yeah, and again, these are two great storytellers that I've known. Let me start here with Justice Hill. Met him at NABJ in 1998. He offered to critique the work of any writer that needed
Don't tell
help.
that story. Oh, God.
And he says that he should have just ran away when he met me. So
Should have.
yeah. So and Daphne Durrett, who met when we both worked in the Miami market, and it's been great to see her grow throughout her career. Let me start off with Justice. You have a few opening words. What does storytelling mean to you?
I didn't expect that question.
Yeah.
It's no different for me than reading a novel. Good stories have a beginning, middle, and an end. That's pretty simple. But how do you get there in the narrative style that we tend to use, which is the inverted pyramid, which is not designed for storytelling. It's designed for convenience and things like that. And it doesn't lend itself to some of the things that I'm going to touch on
Sure.
as we go along.
Daphne, what are you excited about that we're going to talk about? Some of the tips that we're going to give.
I think before as we were planning for this talk, I've learned a lot from Justice through this process. So I'm more excited for Justice's tips than mine.
Please.
Yeah, I know. I'm setting you up here, but I'm also excited to hear from you guys what questions you have about storytelling, and I'm excited to hear the kinds of stories that you want to tell. So,
Professor QR code?
yeah.
So I'm going to give you guys QR code in a second. Unfortunately, we don't have a TV screen, but you better follow on your
You can
phone.
do it now, and I'll tell them like what we're gonna be doing. So, the panel is five tips to becoming a better storyteller on your beat, and so we're all gonna be like coming from some different perspectives. Justice is going to be talking about the writing process and how to incorporate storytelling and elements into your stories as you write them. I'm going to be talking about the perspective of how to gather the kinds of things in the field as you're reporting that will help you be able to tell good stories. And Gary's going to finish us up with his perspective as an editor, and talk about the kinds of storytelling elements he likes to see in the stories that he edits. So that's what we're going to be. That's what we're going to be doing here. Justice, do you want to add anything else about like storytelling and what is a story versus what versus like remember that discussion we were having about reports versus storytelling? I wish I could have wrote down what he said because it was amazing. But can you tell our group here the difference between a report and a story, please?
Well, one of the things about storytelling takes time. And one of the enemies of writing today is that we don't have a lot of time. And it's hard to write well, really good stories. And one of the things I'm going to touch on in my 5 tips, if somebody sends you out to, most of my career, a lot of my career has been spent as a sports writer. So a lot of stories I have to tell are on deadline. So I have, maybe the game is over and I have 5 minutes to file the story. So how do I not lean a little bit on the inverted pyramid? Early in my career, I did. And the more experience you get, you find ways to be able to create a story that the inverted pyramid isn't an enemy of it. Because as I said a minute ago, the inverted pyramid is designed to say stop any place. A real good story, let's say you're reading a short story. I'm big on short stories, and I'm going to encourage all of you to become more interested in short stories. But how do you understand a story, the end of it, if you stop halfway through? One of my favorite short stories is one by James Baldwin. It's called Sonny's Blues, and you can get it on the internet. It's just a marvelous story about these 2 brothers going in different directions, but you cannot stop at the end of that story, halfway through that story, and understand it, because the ending matters. In any good story, if you're doing good storytelling, your stories will have that beginning, a middle, and an end. And you can do it on deadline once you learn how to juggle the information. Let me go to my tips, and I think that'll be helpful. One of the things that I wrestled with, because I was an editor, sports editor for a total of about 10 years, college professor, right, Earl? One of the things I wrestled with is getting young people to understand what a story was. And so many people, they go out and do the reporting, and they can't wait to write. And I have a philosophy: first the idea, and then the story. A lot of times, you don't even know what the idea is because you haven't come back with the information and dissected it. What do I have here? I think if you're a good writer, before you write anything, the first paragraph, you should be able to write a headline on your story. And you also should have some idea of what the ending of the story is. Some stories are organic, where you don't know what the ending is. But I'm about to show you a story where I absolutely know, well, I know she knew because she came and spoke to one of my classes. She's got a story about this 99-year-old guy who was still working. And if you have it, it's called, the guys on the thing is called The Writing Tip, and it's Murray Newton. If you can call it up, I just want you to look at the first couple of paragraphs. And in those first couple of paragraphs, there are some things that she does that are absolutely marvelous.
Can you pause for a second? I just want to tell everyone how to find it. In the Google Drive that's connected to the QR code, you'll see our PowerPoint, and you'll see another folder that says handouts. If you open up that folder, and if you go to Writing Tips, Murray Newton doc, that is the story that he's talking about. So we'll give you just a second to pull it up. I didn't mean to interrupt
That's
you.
okay.
I just wanted them to find it. Okay, so you can go ahead.
One of the things, it won't take you long to read the first part of it, but at the end, I'm going to ask you at the end of this conversation, what do you think, how do you think she's going to end the story? I'm going to ask you as well, how do you think she got this information? One of the things I talk about, you can't be a good storyteller if you don't master these 3 things: description, detail, and dialogue. I call them 3 Ds. In the beginning of this story, Lane DeGregory, Pulitzer Prize winner, she talks about his alarm beeps at 3:30 a.m. Very specific. The whole scene that she narrates is descriptive, but then she sprinkles details in there. If you go down the first throughout it, paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, then he wraps his paper towel around a piece of fried chicken, packs it into his Coleman cooler, very specific things. And throughout the piece, she does that all the time. And one of the things that I've found, and we're talking about dialogue, after 4 hours later, after he wakes up, he arrives at work. And here's the dialogue that I'm talking about. Not quotes. Too many writers let quotes drive their stories. Nobody wants that. They want conversations, and we have it here. Morning, Mr. Newton, a mustached man calls. Hello, Captain, he says, raising his hand. Beautiful day. Those are the kinds of things that are memorable, certainly in feature writing. But if you're writing stories and it's quote after quote after quote, you're a stenographer. You're not a writer. Writers write. So you take your information, take the best of the quotes that you have, and weave them into something interesting. Those are things, and as you breeze through this paragraph, but the first section, particularly look at it because I want to go back to it at the end of this conversation. But description, detail, and dialogue. But the most important thing for me as a writer and as an editor is, I say this to young people all the time, the majority of the people who write never revise. The final version is never good enough. And if you talk to any writer of with any reputation, if you tell a writer, you've got 5 more minutes before you turn your story in, every good writer will take those 5 minutes and look at it. Look at this story to make sure they have everything right. I do a column once a week for Cleveland Plain Dealer. And one of the things, I have a friend who edits my stories. If he doesn't get to it as soon as I send it to him, I might have to send 3 or 4 versions back to him before he edits it, because I'm always tinkering with stories. Because there's no real deadline on the stories. I have a self-imposed deadline that I send it to him, but I'm always tinkering. I always revise. Certainly there's two terms. On the micro level, where you look at it, the real big picture, and then the macro level, the real big picture, and then the micro level, the words. Is this the right word? Should I have used perhaps or maybe? Should I have used because, or should I use a pronoun here or the person's name? Those are the kinds of things as a writer you always wrestle with. How much do I change my stories? And somebody once asked me, and I'll pass it over to Daphne in just a second, what's my favorite story? And I told him I don't have one. And I've had stories that won awards and everything, because I don't go back and look at my stories because I'll find something I don't like that I would have changed.
Yes.
I don't have a perfect story.
Yes.
And, I had a couple of stories that won awards. I will never look at them again. I will never look at them again, because I said, if I had a chance to redo this, here's what I would do differently. And writers, once you consider yourself a writer, you're committed to a lifetime of learning.
Justice, you ever wrote a story and thought you had something in it when you went back and read it? Wait, I didn't do that in that story, because you learned a new skill since that story published, and you thought you had an element in there. Wait a minute, I didn't know it at the time.
Well, in the early stages, I told you that. When I first started writing, when I first became a sports reporter, I was working at a major newspaper, Detroit News, and I used quotes. I used large chunks of quotes because I thought people wanted to hear these famous people write. Right. They do want to hear it, but they want to hear your narrative. They don't want to then just give them the tape and let them listen to the tape. Mm-hmm. They want to hear you tell me the best of the stuff that you've given. And I got to tell a quick story before I pass on. There was an intern at the Detroit News. It was a young guy's name was Julius Key. Julius was a good dude, but So he wrote this story. He had all these great quotes. I mean, they were absolutely marvelous quotes, but they were at the end of the story. And I told Julius, I said, Julius, you need to move some of those quotes up higher in the story. And he said, why? I said, you're an intern. And if they have to cut your story, they're going to cut some of those quotes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I told him, they have a choice between cutting your story or cutting mine, the copy editors. And whose story do you think they're going to cut, yours or mine? They're going to cut yours. So he didn't listen to me. Exactly what I told him happened. They took all his good quotes out of the story. Oh he was upset. And I said, Julius, I told you, you need to move some of those stuff up, especially when you're working for a newspaper when length was an issue. On the internet, it's less of an issue. If he had written it today, it probably would have survived. Daphne.
That was great.
What?
No, I just, I've been there. I've been Julius. Julius is me. I've done that before. And I'm just laughing. And thank God for the justices in the newsroom that will, like, try to help you out even when you won't listen.
You have to help yourself. You have to
Yes,
listen.
yes. So as I was saying before, Justice, the great tips that Justice gave were about the writing process. And so I want to take a step back and talk about when you're out in the field, or you're at that city council meeting, or you're at the court hearing, or you're at the breaking news event, how to gather the materials that'll help you tell the story when it's time to write. And my first tip is something that I learned. One of the first tips that I learned in my career when I was covering a big breaking news story, and it's kind of become a cliche, I think, in the news business. But this is probably one of my favorite ones, and that's zig when everyone zags. So how many of y'all have been to a big breaking news event, and all the television stations and newspapers in your market are at one scene in one place waiting for the PIO to come out and give you information. So I started off my career after college. I was the night cops reporter in St. Louis for 2 years, and both years St. Louis, I think, led the nation in like murder rate. So I was out on a lot of crime scenes in the heat, in the snow, and everything in between. And I had a lot of time to wait for people to come out and give me information. So I think I found the best stories when I kind of wandered around a little bit. I didn't stay with everybody else that was waiting for somebody to come out to get the information that everybody gave. Going around, talking to neighbors, talking to people that you may not think is directly connected to an event. Going to, if you're, I spent a lot of my career covering courts. So covering a court case, talking to someone in the courtroom that may not have a direct connection to the case, but might have some information that makes for a good story to tell later. I was covering a death penalty case once, and there was a woman sitting behind some of the defense attorneys, and I just sat and talked to her. No one else. It was a big case that like a lot of people were covering, and I went up and I just talked to her one day, and I found out she was something called a mitigation specialist, which is someone who works with the defense team in death penalty cases to give the court information that might basically help save someone from the death penalty, finding out that person's background and all of that kind of stuff. And this was a death penalty case where a defendant had a young son. And so she and I started talking about that, and she started talking about the children of death row inmates and the kind of trauma that they go through. And that became a story. I think I won my first like Florida SBJ award from telling that story. It wasn't like the story that everyone was telling. It wasn't really right in line with the case. It wasn't like, okay, today such and such person testified about this, but it was just because I was straying from the herd of what, where everyone else was doing. I was able to find someone that had, that was able to illuminate a larger issue. So that's my first tip, zig when everyone zags. Also, okay, I guess I'm running the cliches here. My second tip is to major in the minors. So, and this is a tricky one because we know, especially when we think about the inverted pyramid structure, we want the most important information at the top, and the less important information is kind of like at the bottom if we mention it at all, right? So, and I know that this is a curse of a lot of reporters that will go to a city council meeting and want to put in every detail of what happened to the meeting, and then you come back with like a 30-inch story when your editor only asked for 8. I get that. I'm not saying do that, but what I'm saying is sometimes the best story to tell is not the highlight news event. It's something that is maybe, you know, the 8th item on the agenda of the city council meeting, which wasn't the reason that you really went to the meeting, but there's an interesting story there. That's where you find your stories. I'll give you another example from another death penalty case that I covered, where I was in federal court, and at the time we weren't allowed to bring laptops into federal court. So I had to write my daily stories, and I would have to, you know, sit in the courtroom during the day, and during the breaks I would have to go outside to, I had an SUV, and I would like pop the trunk and sit in the back and type stuff out in the breaks. So this is real like breaking news, you know, have to write something in a few hours kind of mode. And one day there was someone who was testifying in the trial, and he was an informant. And it was a murder case involving a drug cartel, and he was one of like the underlings of the cartel. And so he wasn't really an important witness in the case. He was kind of the kind of person that maybe under other circumstances you could have described in 2 or 3 paragraphs and let it go. But when he was sitting on the stand and he was testifying, the prosecutor started asking him about his life and where he had been up to this point. And he was talking about how when he was 15, he was a really good baseball player. And at 15, he had been scouted by Major League Baseball recruiters. And so at 15, he had this like track of being very, very successful. And then, you know, like 5 years later, he was, you know, sleeping on the floor in this house called Thug Mansion, and his nickname was Crackhead Kevin. So that's the story I told. At 15, he was like a prospect, and you know, 5 years later, that's where he was. And then I went back and I told the story about how he got from point A to point B. So it really wasn't, like I said, he wasn't a big witness. But he had a story. And so sometimes if we think about the top line thing that we're supposed to be covering, we will miss a good story to tell, because sometimes the best story to tell isn't the assignment that your editor gave you, and isn't like the you know, like the top of the news. So I ended up telling that story, and I weaved like the other things that I came to court for that day. I just kind of summarized them at the end. So I flipped the normal structure of how we do things. And sometimes that's the best way to tell a story. Number 3 is use your senses. So a lot of times we focus on the dialogue and what people say, and that is very important, but also looking at nonverbal cues, looking at how people, you know, the person who's wringing her hands because she's nervous, or, you know, someone who's playing with their hair, or, you know, just all the like things that you can describe to show the reader a scene of what happens. And this is where I want to shout out Nichelle Smith, who is sitting in the audience, who helped me very much become a better storyteller. I worked with one of several stories I worked on with her was about we were looking at the history of interactions between police and people of color. And we went on a very like spiritual journey to find a man named Bras Coupé, who was a enslaved man in the 1800s, and he was a police brutality victim back then, who was framed for a couple of murders. And so sometimes it's hard to use your senses when you're not there live, right, on the scene of what happened. Like, we don't have time machines. We can't travel back like 200 years to figure out, you know, like what the swamp looked like when Bras Coupé was there. But we know, you know, sometimes you can look at documents, sometimes you can look at other materials to figure out where an event happen and use descriptions from that. And I think that Nichelle helped me do that in that story. So even when you're on the scene is the best way to do it. But when you're not on the scene and you have other documents or you have other things that have descriptors that go beyond just the words of the scene, it's using your senses to try to paint a scene for the readers is a good way to tell the story. So these last, oh, you know,
Yeah, we go way back.
I should have known. I should have known.
Do you mind if I interject?
Yes, go ahead.
You all,
I'm happy.
You have an amazing panel in front of you. Our elder statesman, I'm sorry, senior statesman, seasoned statesman.
Yes.
Hill, who has just been in the game forever and ever.
Well, that sounds bad. I'm not Methuselah.
Short of forever.
He's done a lot in 3 short years.
Exactly. Gary, who I'm just meeting, but it was a project that I was on tap to do. He took over for it and did an outstanding job corralling all of the information and doing an essay that really captured the spirit of Juneteenth. And Daphne here, as she's talking about this story, Broad Coupe, I could not contain myself from interjecting because she's being way too modest. When we looked at Broad Coupe, tip that I will interject is bring yourself to the story. And awful lot of times we're not taught that in journalism schools. We're taught to be absolutely perfect white journalists when you really look at what we're taught. Bring yourself to the story because Daphne's Haitian background was of immense help with this story. This story took place in New Orleans at a time when the Haitian Revolution was frightening all of the white slave owners. Nobody knew what to do. So she's telling the story of a man who's in the wrong place at the wrong time. Had she not been Haitian, had she not had a command of Old French, she would never have been able to look at all of the documents that nobody else would have been able to sort out. So that's how bringing yourself to a story helps. We exonerated this man 400 years after what he was accused of doing, and that is all because Daphne brought herself to the story.
Okay, we're not gonna keep going back and forth like this, but I'm telling you, I would have no story without
I'm done.
Nichelle. But yeah, those are, I mean, like I said, sometimes you're not always there to see what happens, but there are ways to, even as you're reading a document or even as you're reading something historically, to use your senses as you're reading to look at the details that evoke certain, sounds, smells, whatever, that you can, take note of those things in your reporting to use for your stories. Another one is to tell the story of an entire thing through one example. I found that sometimes I still do this, but I would say more earlier in my career, I would over-report and I would want to give an example for every single case that I found that pertained to like a particular thing. Some friends of mine and I'm at the Marshall Project now, and some of my colleagues and we were talking about a story where there were several people who, several public figures who were saying the same thing about a particular issue, and the person who was reporting the story quoted each and every person like saying basically like the same thing. And while that is accurate, and from a reporting standpoint, there's nothing wrong with letting everybody know that 5 people agree that, that a particular thing was wrong, right? But for the purposes of storytelling, your storytelling is better served if you use one example and flesh out that example and then talk about how, four other city councilmen agree. And just focus on that one example, tell the story through one example. One of my easy, cheats when I'm writing, and I guess this is somewhat of a writing tip and not a reporting tip, but I'll just tell it anyway. One of the things that I like to do when I'm thinking about telling a story, I think the easiest way to do something is when there's a problem that I'm talking about, start with the anecdotal lead that says, you know, this person, this happened to this person, and then zoom out and say, this is one of just, 25 cases in the past 2 years where this has happened to people. And then in your nut graph, you just explain, the problem, and then you zoom out, you tell the larger story, and then you just go back to that particular person, and you can tell a whole story like that, just, through the narrative thread of one story, and then take different aspects of that person's story and zoom out and talk about how, what they're experiencing or what you're telling at that time is part of a bigger problem. So last tip is to immerse yourself in a scene. So if you're covering a particular issue, and of course this is one of those things, like if you have the luxury of time, if you don't have to, churn out a couple of other stories in the day, just staying at a scene for a little while where something happened, and just to see what happens, just to see who comes in it, a diner where someone, where a crime victim used to work. If, that person worked, the Tuesday evening shift, and you have time to and space to work from there, like that afternoon, just sitting there and being on the scene, seeing who comes in and out, seeing if it's a busy day, or if it's like a light day, or what kind of dishes they serve, on a day, so that when you're telling the story, you can be like, Sally Smith used to work at Waffle House, where on Tuesdays most people order blah blah blah. That's a little something extra that you're adding to the story that you wouldn't have if you wouldn't just spend time on the scene. I know we can't always do that. Trust me, I most of my career, I've covered a beat where, I had to write about the murder story of the day almost every day. But whenever you have time, even if it's just a couple of hours, going to the scene, working from a particular scene, I think helps get some more storytelling elements. I think I'm done. Gary?
Sure. Let me pause first. Excuse me. Any questions so far? Any questions? Anything? Okay. Anybody? Please. Yes.
I'm sorry, I was a little bit late. Could you maybe recap what the tips were, really quickly?
Yeah.
Mine were, first the ideas in the story, description, detail, and dialogue, and the fifth was revision.
There's a QR code that we were bringing around. If you
There-
don't have it, it's all in there. I'll make sure everyone has it. Please.
Question is, I work in Orlando, and our market size is huge. My beat is Marion County, which is like an hour and a half away from the city of Orlando, and I'm a morning show reporter, so I get off that beat. So this is almost impossible. But how do you stay on top of things when you're so removed from a community that you're assigned to?
You want to go ahead, Jason?
No,
Okay.
that's not my expertise.
I have a question for you. So you live in Marion County, or you live in Orlando, and you report on Marion County?
Yeah, now it's not like the only thing I cover. I cover general assignment, but part of my duties is to stay on top of things. So they don't ask for too much, but again, this is a community that's between Gainesville and the city of Orlando. And Gainesville generally is a lot of college students. It's in the middle, so it's very deprived of proper coverage from each market, if that makes sense. So I'm trying to bolster our coverage to help. It's like a food desert for jobs.
How active are you on social media?
Pretty active.
Pretty active. So you go to a frozen yogurt spot. You're taking a picture of yourself there, and you're doing this and doing that.
No,
You're biking around town. You're using your brand to help to engage with people. That's only one piece, but that's an example of a piece of ways. We all know you don't have to expose your entire life, but pick a spot of your life. So for me, it was boxing and cycling. It was more active things. when I first got to Murfreesboro, Tennessee, before I showed up in Nashville, I biked a lot. And so it was always a photo of me biking around town. And that was my way to introduce myself to the community, especially because it was during the pandemic where, we were socially distancing. So that was my space. Do you drink coffee?
I drink tea. I go to coffee shop.
Yeah, that's a lot of meetings around town. A lot of, yeah.
And I think that, I was just gonna interject really quickly, and I think the goal of everything what Gary is saying is when you're far removed from a community to know what's going on and to get tips, you need sources, and so that's the big thing, focusing on source development and the other thing too is once you have the source, taking time out of your day, taking time out of your mornings, because I know you're doing the morning show, but after the morning show, calling someone that you met on a previous story that you're working on when you're not on deadline or when you don't need them for a particular story, and just talking to them, just having conversations with them when you're not on deadline and when you don't need them for anything, and then being open and say, hey, I'm trying to figure out what's going on in Marion County, and if you're let's say like it's a police source you have, for example, hey, would you mind letting me know like what's going on? Or I mean, it's just what you're gonna have to do because you don't have the proximity to be able to immerse yourself every day, and because of your shift, you just are gonna have to use sources. You can't, because you can't physically be there. I think one thing I would say that one of the best I think lessons I've gotten from reporters who came before me is the importance of not, when you have to talk to someone, calling over emailing or meeting with them in person whenever you can over phone calls, just having trying to establish the closest connection you can with everyone. It's great that we have these now that we can just text someone to get an answer to a question that we have, but it's not always the best way to connect to a source in a way that they're going to call you without you having to call them if they have something important for you. So that would be my suggestion. Justice.
There's no stories in the newsroom, none. So you have to get out and meet people. You have to talk to people. As much as I like these, nobody's ever kicked me out of their office. I've never had somebody kick me out of the office. I had people say I had to go because I had another call coming, but nobody's ever kicked me out of the office. So go talk to people. Go to the office. You can't meet everybody, but if you meet enough of the right people, they will tell you about other right people that you should talk about. There's a big project Delvis knows. I'm really committed to bringing black boys back into baseball. And so I drive the Cleveland Guardians and everybody in Cleveland crazy about this. But I've had people call me because I've met them, council people, who called and told me certain things. I said, oh my God, I didn't know that. How much the teams contribute to the city, the exact figures and so you call the team and you say, oh, I got this, and now they want to kind of polish it up. But I got that because I met these people. And people will tell you just incredible things if they trust you.
Best time to meet somebody is when you don't need anything.
Yeah.
In life and in your career, right?
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, I figuratively throw my reporters out of the office and say, go have a cup of coffee with somebody. Because we had a school shooting in Nashville earlier this year, 6 people killed, including 3 9-year-olds. And we were up against the gun. And
bad choice of words.
Bad choice of words. Thank you. Horrible. What am I thinking? Excuse me. And I recognize around that time that we need to do a better job of being prepared for sourcing in the community. And I'm not just talking about council members and people in government officials, but people in the neighborhood. The same way people complain about policing not being as personable. We want to do a better job of giving people access to everyday journalists. So I want to before I jump into a few of my tips, I want to explain a few things that If you're not sure if you're a storyteller, you're wondering why you may not be one or what you can do. A couple things, in my opinion, I see. Sometimes I think we create content that we wouldn't read or watch ourselves.
That's a good point.
And we understand you got to feed the beast. We understand that everything isn't going to be of interest to us. I get that. But you can still have fun with it. I'm in Fresno, California, working for the Fresno Bee. I have to write a story about a rodeo. I'm from New Orleans. So just know this is my first time. So I'm going to have fun with it. So I wrote a story from
You
the
did have fun with it, too.
I wrote a story.
Actually, I use it in one of my journalism classes as an example of what he's about to tell you. I mean, this is just a crazy story. I'm sorry.
I wrote a story from the perspective of the bull. I wrote a narrative story from the perspective. The bull was the athlete, because in rodeo, the bull is the athlete.
That's
wrote-
cool.
I had fun with it, right? Now, you can't do that on certain beats or certain elevated stories, but it was a rodeo. And that was a story that's supposed to be a little 10-inch story. I said, man, if I'm going to go out here, I'm going to do something. I'm going to have fun with this. And I experiment. If it's another tip, experimenting. I experiment on stories that have a lower priority, so I'm in a better place when those bigger stories come. Francis Ford Coppola, before he created The Godfather, he created Once Upon a Time in America as practice to get ready for that movie. So I experiment. Another tip, another challenge we have. I think early in your career, the first 7 years, too many of us, I would argue, are trying to specialize too fast. While I think it's great to work on stories that are important to you, imagine if you can write a kick-ass story about something that means nothing to you or little to you. Imagine if you can make that, because that story is important to the community. Imagine if you can make that if they make that story sing, versus, and then you go back to something that moves you. So I'm kind of telling you both sides of that.
Okay, let me say something,
yeah.
because I kind of disagree with you a little bit on that.
Of course.
Ooh, here's where it gets
For
spicy.
this reason, everything I put my name on matters to me. The little story of the small thing, that matters to me, because that's my name, that's my brand. So I'm not going to shortchange that little story because my name is on it.
I completely agree with you, but you're in the business 30 plus years. I'm
I'm
yeah.
talking about even early in my career. My name was on it.
And everybody's human, everybody's different. So
Well, yeah.
so speaking of, so I'm not speaking of myself. I'm not speaking of a lot of people in this room. There are a lot of people that are in this business that are not in this room, that are not at this conference. So people that I've worked with, people that I've met, I see a lot of passion. I love racing culture. It's part of my job, writing about these stories. But if you're your first job out of the business, or you're a college student and you want to specialize in that beat, don't be afraid to write about something that you know nothing about, because it helps your growth later in your career.
I don't disagree with that.
Yeah,
I'm just saying
yeah, it's just
that
different. Same
I don't
thing,
believe
same
in a
thing,
throwaway story.
I don't either. I believe in everything that your name is on it. You want to do something with it that's special. And experimenting doesn't mean, you're still trying to do something special. Let me get into a few of my tips, which speak to, when I was trying to think, how do I explain storytelling if you're not storytelling? Imagine playing a guitar with one string. It's a tune, but there's so much you're missing out on. So many creative opportunities you're missing out on.
Mm-hmm.
I love to humanize stories. I love my reporters humanize stories. If I can close my eyes and someone read your lead to me, or they give me that first, a lot of you guys in TV in this room are in a broadcast, so you'll get this, that nat sound, that opening. How are you pulling me in those first couple of seconds? Because we're not guaranteed that people are going to get past the first 3 seconds of a package or the first 30 words of a story, right? So unlike boxing where you jab, 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 the big punch, you got to hit them right off the top. You got to connect them. Treat this like you are a screenwriter, because to some extent you are. We all seen that movie that in the first few seconds, the hero of the movie is falling off a cliff in slow motion, and there's a narrative. I never thought my life would end like this, but here we go, da-da-da-da. Then it flashes back to 2 days later, 2 days earlier.
2 days
2 days,
earlier.
2 days early, right? That structure is a package, That structure, I've used that structure many times to write a story, right? We go 90 minutes into the movie, you find out he landed on a balloon, save the day 10 minutes later. Like, that's a basic structure for a story. Couple other tips. Daphne touched on this real quick. Writing with authority, Justice did too. Your words are more important than the quotes. Let the quotes support you, not the other way around. It takes time. It takes a few years in your career to really feel comfortable with that. But that's when you really know your storytelling. And the last quick tip I'll give you is sprinkling breadcrumbs. When I worked here in Nashville the first time, our columnist told me this: have something special in every single paragraph you write, or if this is a script, every as you go down the script. So not just the beginning, not just the end, but give the reader or viewer something every few seconds or every few words that forces them to keep reading and watching. It's like, damn, I don't have time to read this 1,500 word story, to watch this entire package, but it's so good I can't put it down. So that has really helped me out. Let me pause for a second. Any questions that you guys have? Yes?
Who was your lead in the Bull story, do you remember?
I will find it, and I will quickly find it, yeah. Any other questions? I know I quickly explained, we had a question in the back, one second. I know I quickly explained how the bull came to be there because his father had never met him.
That's the worst.
His father had never met him.
Yes,
this really is
How do you know
a
this?
story that.
So it's just like your story.
When he told me about it, I said, "Oh my God, they ran it."
Yeah, now you get
So-
it. We will. I will. Once he pulls up the story, I will add it to the QR code, so you guys can read
Just
about
note
it.
that bulls don't do very well in the whole birds and bees process. So a lot of time there's a human involved that just takes, it gets messy. Anyway, I'll say that.
Okay, so his father. So he didn't know his father.
His father never
This
met
part
him.
of his issues?
His father never met his mother.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
Yeah,
so
just-
this is Bill and origin story. Go ahead.
Yes, we'll come back to a question in the back.
Could you maybe re-explain the sprinkled breadcrumbs? I don't think I'm understanding what you mean by that.
Sure. 1 second. I will.
And I can help too.
Yeah, I'm going to pull up an actual story example of that.
Well, she won't be able to see it though, Gary.
Well, I'm just going to read it. I'm going to read it's a 300-word story. Just
But basically, as you're doing that, basically sprinkled breadcrumbs is like, don't give everyone everything right away. Like, don't give them the ending, in the beginning. Just
Well, you certainly don't want
set
to
up
do
the
that because
yeah,
then
set
you're
up the
saying, I'm
no,
gone.
but sometimes you can give them the ending and then go back, like Gary was saying. These are just different storytelling techniques. Sometimes you can start with the ending, and as Nichelle was saying earlier, I'm from Haiti, and the storytelling tradition in Haiti is sometimes we start storytelling with the end. So you can sometimes give away the end, but if you're trying to set up, I think, the suspense.
Well, yeah, because you see
Yeah.
that in one of my favorite books that I was watching, God, Zora Neale Hurston gives it.
Yes.
I mean, you know how.
Yeah.
And now it's how do you get to there? It's the rest of the narrative.
Yeah.
If you haven't read the book, you should read it. Though.
It's amazing.
All right, let me
Okay.
read through this. I'm going to butcher some things here. A few drivers on this dark, lonely stretch of Suncoast Parkway in Pasco County pull up to the toll booth, hand their dollars to Lloyd Blair, and then speed away. None of them knows why the old man sits here night after night working the graveyard shift. You should start to see an older gentleman in a toll booth. Well, here's why. Because years ago, on a freezing winter night at a party in Queens, New York, he met a woman named Millie. If you want to know the breadcrumb, it's when you start to see something in your head. It's going to be move everybody differently, but for me, it was when, he met a woman because of the simplicity of the language for me. Because
I'm just interjecting, and you're thinking, okay, what does this woman have to do with why he became
it's stringing you
to
along.
operate? Yes.
Damn, I can't put this down. because he fell in love with her brown hair and wide eyes and 100-watt smile. To me, it was the brown hair and wide eyes. That was the breadcrumb. Because they got married, moved to Staten Island, had a son, and worked for decades in Manhattan. She as an accountant, he as a banker. Because it had been their dream to retire to Florida, so they saved all their lives to make it possible. Because just as they began to talk about leaving New York and head to South, she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and they spend their time and money traveling to New Jersey, San Diego, and Mexico in search of a cure. Because in the end, they came to Florida anyway. Because they finally bought a house in Spring Hill, although she was too weak that day to get out of the car. Breadcrumb. Because 9 days later, on January 5th, 2002, she died, a day the whole sky fell, he says. Because after she was gone, he found himself alone and $100,000 in debt. I'm almost finished. This is a short story. And so he took a job collecting tolls. The drivers who passed by seeing a smiling 71-year-old man with blue eyes and a gray mustache who tells each of them, "Have a great night." For me, it was blue eyes and gray mustache. They don't know the rest of Lloyd Blair's story, or that he keeps Millie's picture in his shirt pocket, just under his tag name, just over his heart. That's the entire story. It's a 300-word story. You don't need 3,000 words to do something special. You don't have to have a 5-minute package to do something special. It's 300 words. Yes?
And that was a beautiful story, beautifully told. Explain for people how you convinced your editor to let you do it. Because as I'm
Yes,
listening to
'cause
you,
you're
in
the
the back
person.
of my head are all those editors who are going, where's the nut graph? You don't have the nut graph.
I can answer that for
I'm
you.
gonna give it
He
to
was
Judge.
the editor.
Well, so
You're under- sorry,
there's
you're
an
editor.
art to being professional that we all, depending on where you're at in your career, that comes with the job. There's an art to knowing how to pitch stories. I actually was horrible at pitching a story early in my career. Because how do I pitch a story that I haven't executed yet? How do I pitch a story I don't know all of what it is? It gets to a certain point in your career where you can just say, hey, I'm going to write about this. And the editor's like, cool. Because they know you, you know them. Early in your career, you got to explain a little bit more. Well, I'm going to do this. They want to know what's going to make the stories pop, what's going to make it different. There's an art to this. I think this project is, the 300-word stories are an example of, that's a conversation I would have even before I go out and find Mr. Blair. I want to tackle this. Oh, this is the type of storytelling I want to work on. That's maybe a little bit different. You know what it is. Might be a little bit different than what we do every day. What are your thoughts about this? I think I've gotten a little bit better in the whole emotional intelligence thing. That's help pitching. How do you before you pitch it? How do you get your editor in a space where they start to embrace this because they know it's important to you? They want you to work here. They want you to be happy here. They want you to thrive.
I'm sorry, Gary,
Yes.
Gary, I have to interject here.
Yes.
Maybe you're a different kind of editor, but most of the editors I worked with, aside from like the Nichelles of the world, they didn't care about what was important to me.
You find a way. You demand it,
Sorry.
and if they don't, then that's not a place for you to work. I mean, it's pretty simple. This is a business. But so I'm just saying you at
but
least
I
ask.
also think a good way to approach that conversation is to describe how telling that story, especially if you're in a newsroom that has like metrics that track how, you know, this story might be, I don't know, off a certain news event or something like that, that will get a lot of clicks or what. I think sometimes you have to find out what's important to your editor as well, and find a way to kind of like finesse your pitch that will appeal to whatever she or he thinks is important as well.
Because it's something I think that you're forgetting when you say that. You have an obligation to learn how to manage your editor.
Yes.
Just
Yes.
as you manage, that they manage you, there are certain times, you know, better times to talk to an editor about a story than others. You have to learn that. And if you don't, you're more often than not, you're going to get your stories turned down. As for metrics, the 300-word story concept is absolutely amazing because you get to write about ordinary people. People will remember that story more than they will remember the story of the guy who was arrested for selling bootleg tapes or something like that. They'll remember because it's an ordinary story. It's not long. You don't have to invest a lot of time in it. And those are the kinds of things I think that do well. If they're counting the number of clicks that you do, if that's really important, those stories are going to get a lot of clicks. And in fact, you can do, if you want to, a couple of those stories a week to increase your story count. But they have to be on ordinary people, not on somebody. You wouldn't do a 300-word piece on Barack Obama.
Defeats the purpose. Yeah.
You just wouldn't. But
You-
on the toll keeper or the cafeteria worker or somebody who you talked about, the diner, who serves you tea at a coffee shop. I mean, why do they do that? Or the driver that we had coming over here from Uber. Just a fascinating story.
Yeah,
That she works 2 jobs and she does Uber between, she does an hour a day before she goes to her second job.
And if you want to talk numbers for a second, I can play with numbers for a second. We timed it. Our better reporters can do this soup to nuts in 90 minutes. Now, that's our top-end reporters. Because when we go out, we literally drive around or walk around and find someone. Hi, introduce yourself. Because everybody has a story, right? So how about we start telling more of their stories? So this is not something we just planned out. We literally just drive around. Okay, you've got a dog. Someone was selling a boat. Someone was in love sitting on the floor at a Greyhound bus station. Introduce yourselves. Tell a story. Go out and go back and transcribe it. Write it. It's practice. Because if you can tell that 300-word story fast in 2 to 3 hours, again, I best do it in 90 minutes. Imagine if you do have when you do get 3 days or you get 2 days, right? Imagine, so it's practice. Your name is on it, so you carry all the way, but you got to be able to take some chances. You got to be able to get content that's important to you, but also important to people. So
Think about, you remember the story I mentioned at the beginning about Murray Newton, the guy, the 99-year-old guy that Langer Gregory wrote about? How do you get an editor to let you go and do a story like this unless you've had some success in the past? That you know what to pitch to an editor. There's a 99-year-old guy who works. Who cares? I mean, who really cares? Why is he still working? Okay. But a story of this length?
does anybody do pre-reporting? You guys familiar with the term pre-reporting? Okay. What does it mean to you?
So for me, before I even pitch anything, I've spent time, if I had a conversation with somebody that I just met from another story maybe, then I've made contact with whomever that person is. I've started to have a conversation, usually no more than 15 to 20 minutes, but to learn more about their story. It's all of the background. So then once I get the background, you mentioned about breadcrumbs, but I'm getting all of that information through this phone call. So by the time that I go make a pitch to my manager, I'm already telling you what the story is, and it's not a no. It's okay, go do it.
It's just like basically a sizzle to some extent,
So I
right?
have the
Yeah.
liberty, the freedom of being able to pursue more of the things that, not to say that I don't ever get the stories of, hey, we need to go do this, but I have more freedom to do that when I've already done my homework on the front end.
Love it. Thank you.
We've got time for a couple more questions, and there were some hands up. Hi.
My name is Clara Bellamy. I'm a reporter with NBC News, NBC Black. And something that I wrestle with is like in writing a story, trying to determine what information should I include and versus also like what should I exclude. And sometimes when writing, it's like I feel like all this information is interesting. So how do you decide what you should exclude, especially when you're trying to story tell in a way that's compelling to draw the reader in, but also want to get straight to the point as well?
Justice taught me this, so he's gonna. I'm sure he's gonna jump in on this.
I don't know.
Theme. Pick a theme. It's better to write everything about this narrow theme than to write just this a broad. Like pick a theme and write the shit out of that one theme on that subject, whatever the theme is, versus including everything. And you got a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of that, but you don't go in depth with anything.
Justice, before you jump in, if you're jumping in, I'll just say a quick thing that I always do. I always tell someone the story, like a friend or either another journalist or my mom or somebody. I'll be like, hey, here's what I'm reporting, and I'll see how verbally like the things that I compartmentalize verbally as the most important things to tell her, because normally when you're talking to someone, you don't have like an hour to tell them, like the entire story. And the things that when I'm just talking about something that kind of bubble up to the top of like, or, the things that I get the most feedback on, or like, oh my gosh, really? Like the things that I get a reaction from when I talk about it verbally, I kind of move that up to the top of the details that I want to include.
I think one of the things that you learn over time is how long a story is. I go out and do a story and I come back, I know exactly how long that story is going to be because I visualized the story. And I think it's important to learn, once you have the lead, you have to know what the ending is on any good story. And if you can figure that out early you don't have to know it as you're writing the lead, but you need to know it before you get to the end, because if you don't know where the ending is, you'll keep writing. And and you learn over time, you really do learn, and you're young, you really will learn to say, this is a 500-word story, or this is a 1,500-word story, or this is one that's going to break the bank, so I got to go talk to the editor. This is 3,000 words or 6,000 words. And, to try to piece, I don't know what's the longest story you've ever written, but to piece together a 6,000-word story, you have to have a ton of material. And you have to throw away 90% of it.
I don't want to even think about it.
But you learn over time what things are valuable. And sometimes it's a matter of you making choices. Even some great quotes you'll have to throw away. But especially when you know how long you have to work with in your mind, I think it becomes a little easier to decide what to throw away and what not to. And a lot of the things that we're talking about is just a matter of getting a little bit more experience.
Any other questions before we wrap? Yes, sir.
How do you write your own narrative without leaving out, pretty much leaving out your own opinion?
How do you write a narrative without leaving out your own opinion?
Yeah, like when y'all spoke about rather than just having a whole bunch of quotes and being a stenographer, like actually telling the story in your own narrative, but without interjecting your own opinion.
The sky is blue. Is that an opinion or a fact? It's a fact. Although you could argue that every fact is an opinion to some extent, it's analysis. But I agree with you. So you can just say the sky is blue, and keep going with that. If you were to write a script because you're on TV, right? If you were to write a script about what's in this room, what you see in this room, what it feels like, what it smells like, that's your analysis. That's not an opinion.
I have a
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So touching on the senses that the things that you see, that you experience, that's your space. That's your space to tell a narrative. That's exactly what one-on-one what a narrative is. Go ahead, Daphne.
I was going to say, I think the easiest way out of that is to tell the story through the people whose story it is, So it's hard for you to have an opinion when everything you're centered around is the story that you're telling, and let that person tell their story. That's why it's important when you're interviewing someone to let them tell their stories without any judgment on your part, So when you're talking to someone, if you have a chance to interview that person who murdered 3 people, you don't look at them like you just let them tell the story of why they did what they did or whatever the case is, and try to, in your reporting, not come from a place of judgment, but also, and this is important, especially when talking to people in positions of power, you can be critical and ask questions that force them to answer from an accountability standpoint without judging them, basically, so that whatever in whatever package you end up with or whatever story you end up with, you let people tell the story in their own words, and it is their own words. I covered a case once where it was a guy who he was arrested for fraud and a bunch of fraudulent real estate dealings, and I went to interview him at the jail, and he tried to get me into like a real estate venture while I was at the jail interview. He's like, yeah, like once I get this sorted out, I could show you some strategies. He was from Fort Lauderdale, so he said strategies instead of strategies. And so I thought that was pretty crazy, right? And so I could have editorialized and said like, oh yeah, he's not stopping. He's still up to his old tricks. But all I had to do was tell the story. And I think the last line in the story was like, after this is over, I can show you some strategies, and just showed that he was still trying to do it, which is, I mean, it just showed kind of like how brazen he was, but I wasn't editorializing it in using my words and calling him brazen. So that's the time where you flip, instead of using your own words, you let that person tell on themselves. What I'm gonna do is that particular story, I'm gonna, once we leave here, that QR code that you scanned, I'm going to put a series of links to all the stories that we talked about today. I'm going to add that to the QR code. I think it's something like, Jensen Beach pastor arrested for fraud.
Well, another story is the one that won a Pulitzer. I don't remember her name. Nichelle probably knows. This woman wrote this piece about Dylan Roof, the guy who
Yes.
I mean, just a marvelous story about, and her perspective isn't, he just told his story.
He just told his story.
And here's a black woman who's writing about this guy who kills all these people, and I'm just amazed at what she was able to put together. You remember the story, right?
I remember the story. I don't remember the name of
I don't either.
who
Wrote it. I should.
Yeah, it just almost.
I'll find that and add it as well.
Yeah.
This
Of a monster.
This young white, but also a teenager, young white guy who the cops saw fit to feed Burger King after he's massacred all these people in the church. So there's that the best storytelling along this line of the character sketch has that complexity. Everybody is a complex person. In the session yesterday about Fred Shuttlesworth and the Clotilda, you can see the complexity of Fred Shuttlesworth being this activist, but also this humorous man who happened to have scars on his back from Klan beating. So in telling that narrative, just as this reporter did with Dylan Roof, you are able to see, wow, what kind of complexity creates a person that could massacre all these people in the church that have welcomed him in.
This is why at the beginning, one of the things I said at the beginning of this presentation, it's important that you read. And you read stories that are stories. I'm a big fan of short stories. I read a lot of short stories because they help me understand storytelling. And one of the things I can tell you about short story is it's going to have a beginning and a middle and an end. And it's going to have character development because they tend to be longer than almost any story that you'll ever write. And there's so many good ones out there that speak to us as black people, but there are other, one of my favorite writers, bless his racist heart, is Jack London.
Oh,
and
okay.
Jack London is, he's a brilliant storyteller. He's racist, but, he wrote in the early 1900s. I guess most white people were racist back then, so whatever.
Thank you, guys. We really appreciate it. We'll have everything on the QR code. We'll add to that later. Appreciate y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll be here for a few minutes, so if you have any other questions, you can come up and we can talk.
Yeah.
Hello.
How you
How you
doing?
doing?
Hi.
Good Nashville. Yeah, how you doing?
Pleasure to meet you,
Nice
man.
to meet you too.
Pretty sure I
Hi.
And then this definitely
How's it going, man?
Oh, you beat me, because I,
Well,
my
thank
second
you.
time working there, but I can't.
What do you do?
Clarksville first. Same paper, same company, Clarksville, organization, international, back here in a half.
At NYU? Oh, yeah, NYU.
Okay, two subjects.
All these new
I
things
gotta,
I was there like
give me your information.
I'm like,
Okay, I'm gonna.
this is all new, so.
Wait a minute. I just, hold up. Somebody just showed me this.
Marshall Project.
Catch a drink, what you want to get back?
Somebody just showed me. I love this stuff.
Female homicide victims.
Somebody told me this the other day. I said, oh my God. This is the
Changes the
greatest
game,
thing.
right?
Yeah,
You going to the
yeah,
sports party?
yeah. So if you,
Sports after.
well,